Thank you for inviting me. I am fundamentally an activist for homeless and poor people in New York City. That is my passion, and I have been an activist since 1979, when a small group of us in New York City brought a class action suit against the city and state of New York, taking a phrase from the New York State Constitution that says the government shall provide food, shelter, and clothing for the destitute. And we took the stories that we had collected of men and women that were living in the parks and in the subways to the court. And the court ordered the city and state of New York to provide emergency shelter to every homeless person in the city and state of New York. That's not housing, but they were required under law for the first time in 1979 not to let people freeze to death in New York City. And at that time, an official at New York University told me that between 35 and 55 homeless people die of hypothermia in New York City. And it was that evidence that persuaded the court to order emergency shelter. Now, the result over these 30-some years has been that the shelter system, the emergency shelter system in New York City has gotten massive. There are now 60,000 men, women, and children sleeping in emergency shelters every night in New York City. The majority of those people in emergency shelters are children. More than 24 children have no place to do homework, to put their toys. They have no permanent home at all. The cost to taxpayers in New York City is exorbitant. Now, this note about the cost of shelter is outdated. Since the last 3 years, it has increased by 60%, the cost of emergency shelters. So now the city of New York spends $1.6 billion to shelter these 60,000 people. So Mayor Koch, Mayor Giuliani, Mayor Dinkins, Mayor de Blasio, they all say in speeches that they do more for homeless people than anywhere else in the nation, the state of New York. And that is correct. But it is also because they are under a court order to do so. And you can see that there has been much discussion about creating housing over these decades, but in fact, the number of homeless people continues to increase. This photo is of an emergency shelter in the neighborhood of Harlem, where the city put 1,460 beds in one room. And so each man who needed a shelter bed would get a ticket with a coordinate. You go 20 across and 20 down to locate your bed. And they keep the lights on all night long so they can, for security, and circle in the mezzanine level to keep track of people stealing and violence. And they painted lines under the bed. So the beds with red lines are for people who are homeless living with HIV. The people with yellow lines are the people who are psychotic and live with mental illness. And the people with the blue lines were people with tuberculosis. So in the early 1980s, we first began to try to create alternatives to that barbaric form of emergency shelter. That, of course, it's better than freezing to death, but it is not what one would expect from a civilized and wealthy city like New York. So we began to look for abandoned buildings in our neighborhood and created this concept of social housing. Housing, a place to live with extra help. Extra help finding a job, extra help finding a school, extra help with mental health and other social issues. So we got very experienced over a number of years. Before we made Sugar Hill, we made 6 other buildings of social housing. And we got confident. We understood now where all the money was in government, at the city, municipal level, at the state level, and at the federal level. We discovered where the money was, creating supportive housing. And we decided that to do Sugar Hill, we were going to stop proving to government how to do it correctly. That the first 6 buildings had already showed the model of how to do it, and actually more than 20,000 units of supportive housing were created in New York City over time. The concept grew, the government invested in supportive housing, and more units were created over time. So this is the neighborhood where I work, and when you work in a neighborhood for more than 35 years, you know where the power is, you know where the decision makers are, you know every street, you know of every abandoned building. You become very familiar with the politics and the reality of that community. These are some of the older buildings. The first 6 buildings were all total rehabs. And the Sugar Hill became our first new construction project. There's Mayor Koch opening one of the buildings. All the mayors come when each building opens, of course. This building, we made a New York City historic landmark so that we could get the clay tile roof put on top of it. Has a marvelous garden, and is just 5 blocks from our Sugar Hill building. Another one of the projects, the first one where we began to house homeless families who are living with children. The earlier buildings were for homeless single adults, and by the 1990, we realized that having children and families in housing was very fundamental to normalizing the model. Some tenants. Dorothy Day Apartments, where was 70 homeless families with their children moving into this building, also in West Harlem. Mayor Bloomberg up at the top right. Once we began to house families, we recognized the significance of educational opportunity and cultural opportunities as well. It's really the combination of housing that creates a stability of residents with education, with cultural opportunities that creates a strong and diverse community. This is the first image that David Adjaye created. And you should know that because we were community organizers and activists, we didn't know anything about contemporary architecture. I'd never heard of David before. And we issued a request for proposals to architectural firms in New York City and received 26 proposals from architecture firms, including a proposal from Adjaye Associates. And they came to look at this old garage that we had found that housed the park where parking for 300 cars was possible, underground and 2 levels. And we had acquired the garage, and garages are very important to NGOs because you keep the garage working to pay the soft costs while you're financing the package of funding that's required. So here we established 124 apartments, 20% for homeless families, and the balance, 98, were reserved for people from the community of Harlem, but who were very low income. And the phrase affordable housing is something that gets very freely used, especially by the city, the mayor, current mayor of the city of New York. Affordable housing is his highest priority, but he's talking about affordable housing at a much higher income band, middle class housing. He's not talking about creating housing at the lowest economic bands, which was our mission. We received 48,000 applications for the 98 lottery apartments. It was a arcane, preposterous system of selecting families from the neighborhood. We hired people from the neighborhood to do the interviewing and work with people to fill out all the paperwork, because the city of New York has 23 documents you have to submit to one of their lotteries. It's a formula, and it's these are the initial families moving into their apartments. Families of all different configurations. This is a young man in recovery from substance abuse who takes care of his father who has Alzheimer's. They have a 2-bedroom apartment, more tenants. This is in addition to the museum, which you'll see shortly. We have a community art gallery where neighborhood artists, largely Latino and African American, showcase their work in the gallery. This is our rooftop. We intend to create a green roof, but haven't completed that portion of the project yet. We now, in front of the Sugar Hill Apartments, have a green market with farmers coming in from upstate every Saturday through the growing season that's brought the whole neighborhood to come in to Sugar Hill for the vegetables. Homework clubs, many small meeting groups of children learning to communicate with one another, learning about art, learning about the history of the neighborhood where they now live. Dance class. David has invited Mayor Sadiq Khan of London to come visit us because of the priority of affordable housing in his city as well. The preschool, and you should know that in poor neighborhoods of New York, there are no preschools available. Unlike Switzerland, early education is not a right. Most low-income children go into people's apartments where the television goes turned on and they spend the day watching television because there are not sufficient early childhood programs in poor neighborhoods. Those early childhood programs were built in the 1960s, but there has been no money made available from the Department of Education to build new early childhood centers. The neighborhood of Sugar Hill, you should also know, is where 70% of children in the neighborhood are born into poverty. It's a deep poverty pocket right there. In the preschool, we have developed an architecture curriculum because it's become very apparent to the teachers who are working with these 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds that the impact of their school and the architecture is changing how they think, how they see, and how they communicate. In this curriculum, the children go to visit different iconic buildings throughout New York. They know what an architect does. They know what a contractor does. They recognize David by sight. They know the other buildings that David has created. And they begin to think about architecture as a profession, as a way of seeing. The concept of perspective, of balance, of aesthetic scale. David has left the ceiling of the preschool exposed, so the children also know which are the heating pipes and which are the cold water pipes. They understand how their school was constructed. They also have learned to make blueprints of their own school so they can teach their parents how their school operates. And then they produce structures of their own design at the end of the 8-week cycle of the architecture program. This one clearly was mimicking David's design for Sugar Hill. Remember, these are 3- and 4-year-old children. Yoga classes. There's a mosaic in the back that was created with the artist in residence from the museum that works closely with the children in the preschool. So this is in the front plaza, there are 3 entrances: the entrance to the apartments, the entrance to the preschool, and the entrance to the museum right off the plaza. This is the exhibit that just turned over in the main living room of the museum. There's a stage where there's storytellers, theater, musical performances regularly. This session, or this cycle, the question for the museum is to answer the question, what is a global citizen? And so the exhibits are thematically connected. And this artist is from Portugal, whose piece is about immigration and movement from one continent to another. This is a photographer, Chester Higgins, who's traveled around the world. And the children in the school will know Chester by the time his exhibit leaves, and will have worked with Chester around each one of the photographs. So it's a more intensive museum experience for the young children. A performance in the space. In the first year of opening the museum, we had more than 11,800 visitors. And it's a small museum. It's just 17,000 square feet. But it's unusual in a very poor neighborhood that people flock to the museum. It's not an experience many people have had before, and we sponsor activities to bring people in. The first experience ever seeing a violin in her life, an installation of crowns, an exhibit about power, where power comes from. And this is our artist in residence, Derek, working with a small child who's visiting the museum. His studio. The children in the school selected the artist in residence. A jury of adults and art experts made the first cut from the 55 artists in residence who applied to be have the position, and then the children make the final cut based on the 9 finalists. And those 9 finalists have to do a studio presentation in each classroom, and the children discuss and raise their fingers. I like this one a little bit more, I want that one. And it is a process. Each of the 9 finalists have to present to the 54 4-year-olds. We work a lot with light and shadows, which of course is magnificent in the museum because children understand light now because their preschool is total glazing glass from floor to ceiling throughout the spaces. Children love to perform. They are the most natural artists and natural storytellers if you give them the chance. This is the skylight, a magnificent element in the museum where there is art-making space to the right, where children create their own works of art after spending time in the galleries. That's the homework club. So you can see it's a place, Sugar Hill, where the spirit of community, the spirit of diversity, and family, identity, and community is really celebrated. We think we come together. It's an exciting place to be and work every day. I think we have no turnover in all 120 apartments. Everybody's there to stay, there to grow old. The children will grow up and the children will go to college. That's understood when you move into Sugar Hill. It's possible their parents don't have the opportunity the same way, but we provide educational staff for every child that lives in Sugar Hill to help them navigate the bureaucracy of public schools in New York City. Because there is, no right to equal education, no right to housing, and we need to broker the system to help children at Sugar Hill make sure they sail. This is a neighborhood jazz pianist who comes regularly to the museum, grew up there, and believes that the museum has been made for her. And she attracts many people from the neighborhood, senior citizens, children, elected officials, and you should know when you come to New York that she opens her apartment in Harlem every Sunday afternoon at 3:30, and people are welcome to come. Her name is Marjorie Elliott. It's another original piece of theater produced in the museum. And that's it. So, Glenn? Okay.
I've come as the one of his project directors to talk you through Sugar Hill, which is a project that I've also worked quite rigorously on, as well. I'm from New York as well, from the neighborhood. So I'll just quickly run you through the history of Harlem, Sugar Hill, to sort of appropriate the building within a specific context. And then we'll go into the devices that we wanted to implement within the building to kind of change the cookie cutter regimen that a lot of people are putting up for housing the masses affordably. And then we'll go into final images of what the building looks like now. Not as great images and animated as Ellen's, but so to start, I want to talk about Robert Moses' master plan for low-income housing across New York City. So essentially, New York City, we sort of always had these low-rise slums, and as part of a developer sort of collective to reappropriate these slums and to revitalize the city, they've came up with this sort of idea that they should house, you know, a lot of the residents in these sort of mass housing blocks. And these mass housing blocks was a sort of utopian idea. And this utopian idea was never really tested sort of in its longevity to understand the effects it would have on people psychologically, people economically, and the idea even worse so that they sort of banned around the housing complex with a road which instantly cuts it off from society. So essentially creating this sort of ringed ghetto in a way, which, as we all know now, doesn't really work as a method of housing people affordably. You can see what that model has turned into now, where you essentially, there's a very strong divide between the rich and the poor, essentially, in New York City. And there's this sort of lack of porosity. There's this kind of, you know, standard regimented grid, which creates this idea of housing for people who of low income. And you can see as well that there's a lack of public space, there's a lack of community, and everyone kind of lives in these isolated cells, not very welcoming at all. And these were all the things that we wanted to combat when we decided or when we were asked, really, not that we've decided, but when we were asked by Ellen and her team to submit a proposal for the site. I just want to talk quickly about a few stats, and you can see that in 2013 that the housing crisis in New York City was, I mean, quite high, but not as high as it is now. So between 2008 and so, or to 2013, we kind of had this standard grid of, or sort of standard datum of where sort of the homeless count was in New York City. And from 2013 on, Mayor Bloomberg ended a subsidy program, which essentially caused a spike in the sort of affordable housing crisis in New York City, taking it to about 60,000 people. Beyond that, the people who can afford to live affordably, essentially, if we look at the small graph here, those people spend 70% of their income on their rent, leaving only 30% for you to use for your other essentials in life. And when you do that, what you tend to do is that you end up with this epidemic, really, in the city where people are kind of forced to stay within their compound or within their confines. There's not enough money to sort of go out and to explore and to appreciate the cultural diversity that New York City has to offer. And these were the sort of things that, you know, Ellen and her team really put a lot of effort into combating, and that's why we were really excited to kind of come up with a proposal for this. Again, as Ellen explained, I mean, I can't explain it any better. Broadway Housing sort of launched this competition for us to be a part of. And successfully we won the bid, and we created the sort of scheme for Sugar Hill as you know it. So again, this red dot sort of just appropriates the site in a sort of global context and in the immediate context. And it's in Upper Manhattan where the island starts to thin out. And when the island starts to thin out, what you get is you get these amazing vistas out to, sort of monuments like Yankee Stadium or the Hudson River or New Jersey or even the Harlem River. It's this kind of really great knuckle where the East River turns into the Harlem River, and you kind of have, because of the thinness of the island, you have water on two sides. And it's also where the topography of Manhattan starts to vary quite often, having sort of these peaks and valleys in a way. This is an image of what approximately the site used to look like during the Dutch rule. So this was a sort of old Dutch colony in New York City, and this is approximately, again, from the preservation department, where it kind of shows exactly where the site used to be. And you can see that there's only just sort of small settlement of small-scale housing, and you can kind of start to see the topography change and how it varies. This used to sort of be the respite for a lot of the sort of energy that was happening in the downtown area of Manhattan. And this is what Harlem is today. It's a sort of composite of, sort of mass housing blocks with these sort of really regimented grids. You have mansion blocks, you have low-rise, you have townhouses. You have a sort of wide variety of housing typologies meant to be affordable, but there's just not enough of it. And essentially, that respite line that used to divide Harlem from Lower Manhattan has now been blurred, and sort of the energy of the city has now made its way further north into the city, into Harlem. Not sure if many people know, I'm sure many do though, is that the Harlem Renaissance was also quite a pivotal moment in Black culture within that area of Harlem. It was this sort of celebration of Black culture through arts, through literature, poetry, music. There's this kind of identity in the Black culture in Harlem where people weren't really confined to the interior of their houses. They kind of really like to spend this sort of outdoor area, or sit in this outdoor area and have this sense of community and engage with people within the community, not just within their sort of medium high-rise housing accommodations. And these were sort of these kind of very pivotal motifs that we wanted to replicate within the building and allow the building to foster again, counter to those sort of, dated red singular tower blocks that you see for housing the masses. This is the site. This is our building on the site. And essentially, just to give you a bit of context, I talked about the varying topography. And what you'd find is that between 155th and here, you had to have almost a 20-foot drop in the topography on the main road. And initially, what we wanted to do was to kind of just make this entry off of the main road. But because of the slope or the topography, it wasn't really feasible to make a sort of grand gesture for an entrance. So we looked then at here. We looked at this road and decided that if we were to place the building there, the benefit of that is that we can set the building back and kind of start to create this plaza, again, this medium within the building through a very simple and cheap move to foster community engagement and collective being again. Again, something that's lost in mass housing. Again, the initial sketch, as Ellen showed as well. And what you'd see, the initial sketch from David and what the ideas of the building were is true to the principles that we see now. And it was this idea that off the street level, you have this glazed volume which elevates this sort of muted mass. And these glazed elements are always these elements that are permeable. It's this relationship between the interior and the exterior. It's allowing the interior to make its way in, and it's offering vistas out into the landscape. Again, something that, mass housing doesn't allow for. And not just doing it on the ground level, but then also breaking the mass of the building so we don't have this repeated monolithic block. Essentially what we did is create another cut on a terrace level, which offers really great views, and the setback allows for communal terrace to happen at high level where there's a bit more privacy and the enjoyment of the Manhattan skyline from that point. Again, you can see how that manifests itself in a section, and in the height of the building and in the setback of the building. The two things that were really interesting to us was to contextualize the building within the sort of taller buildings, which then results in the overall height of the building, but then to also contextualize the building to the mansion blocks, which then is the datum in which we set the building back, again creating that communal terrace on an upper level. Off the ground level, you have this sort of public right-of-way that comes right through, that brings the public into the museum, into the galleries, and because of the changing topography, we get these shifts in levels. These shifts in levels end you up in a basement, but what we didn't want is for the building to feel as though it was in a basement. So we started to create these cuts into the ground, creating light wells or these sort of light chimneys, these courtyards, which allow for natural light to permeate into the sort of deepest and darkest parts of the building to enliven it again. Again, in the plan, you can see that the setback that we created off the street side created this public plaza, which is sort of very active. Again, you've seen pictures of it for farmers market. It's where people sit. It's where people congregate and allow residents of the community who don't live in the building to also engage with the residents of the building. It becomes this communal meeting point for the neighborhood. We have 3 entrances, as Ellen explained earlier. We have the entrance for the preschool, the entrance for the residents, and the entrance for the museum, with the museum being here, the residents, the preschool. And so in combining these programs and allowing the synergies of these different programs, we've worked out the circulation to provide privacy where needed, but still allow all 3 of these programs, which normally don't exist together, to coexist and create this sort of bustling vibe within the building. Again, in the plan, you'll see that we have these courtyard moments which bring light down into the basement so that it doesn't feel like it's a subterranean level. So we kind of have one major one upon entry that looks down into the gallery. We have another longer cut, which is a series of courtyards. And then we have this very slender cut, which is that sort of light chimney that I talked about earlier, which gives profound proportions and sort of vast space and light, which is great. We have the sort of basement level, where that light chimney happens just over this circulation space, which acts as a filter. So we have this kind of messy space here where the kids are kind of, making noise or creating art. And this kind of corridor, the circulation corridor, acts as a buffer for that with these niches that allow kids to sit and communicate or to congregate without necessarily overcrowding the corridors. We have, again, this sort of mixed-use space within the middle, and then we have the gallery, and we have a retail space that's accessed from the outside. We can see here in the plan that there's this kind of sawtooth articulation to the edge of the slab, and that sawtooth articulation is meant to essentially break away from a rigid rectilinear block, but then it's also about creating these amazing views out to the context. I mean, I spoke earlier about how Manhattan at that point starts to thin out where the site is, offering great vistas for all sorts of parkscapes and monuments like Yankee Stadium, views to New Jersey, views to downtown Manhattan. And rather than creating these flat views that just offer straight vistas out, it was about trying to create these bay windows that offer somewhat of a panoramic view within the apartments, again, trying to enrich the space through very simple but thoughtful moves. And we can see on the upper level here, towards the south, that you have these courtyard moments and then a bridge with, again, more social space on the exterior. And again, just to reappropriate, that's that sort of long linear light chimney that we've created that takes light down into the basement. You can see here that we have the setback and how that setback creates a sort of communal terrace that allows users of the buildings to congregate. Again, creating these sort of social enclaves within the building was something we were very mindful of to allow for social interaction within the building, allowing residents to get to know one another and not sort of live in this singular modular unit and just kind of come and go and repeat this every day. We really wanted to create this energy of communal being within the building. Then it takes us to the elevation. And then on the elevation, again, you can see that the clear bands here are about articulating this transparency between the interior and the exterior and allowing there to be this kind of relationship or this dialogue between the two. And it's also about alleviating the mass of the building off of the ground plane and elevating it, giving it this sense of a floating mass. And that happens in two places on the elevation of the building. And you can see, due to the drastic change in topography, how that starts to create this basement level, which again is light, or sort of filled with light due to all the cuts that we've made down that takes light into the basement. Then there's the composition of the windows, and again, you know, playing off of the Harlem Renaissance and this idea of the sort of creation of jazz or the element of jazz within the community. We started looking at the elevation as this kind of musical composition where we would play this game where we scattered windows around in a non-linear, regimented way, just to break the rigidity of the building's elevation. And then we have the side elevation where, again, that cut or that transparency sort of wraps around to create this relationship or this allow for vistas out into the parkscape. But then you have this, you know, and this facade is more solid because it's a fire-rated facade that faces an adjacent building, so there were sort of building regulations we needed to deal with, but we didn't want it to feel like an afterthought, so we still played this game of scattering windows around the elevation. And the thing to keep in mind is that these panels are all prefabricated panels, so by just creating this smart logic of maybe 3 typologies, we were able to scatter it to create what looks like this kind of dancing window scheme, but it's a very simple system that was articulated or implemented here for this sort of articulation. Again, looking at it from the front elevation and how you have the solid mass that floats above this sort of glazed floor below, elevating the mass of the building off the ground. And again, the other elevation where you can see the sort of dancing windows. Then it comes to the sort of facade ornamentation, and in surveying the site and being from New York City, you know of the ornamentation that's found quite rigorously around Harlem in abundance. And rather than saying we're going to turn our back against the ornamentation, we were quite fond of finding a way to bring the ornamentation into the building, further contextualizing the building within the overall site. That took us to trying to find an ornamentation. That took us to this idea of celebrating the rose, in which there's actually like a Harlem rose, and using the narrative of the rose to kind of create this this motif on the building that would allow the building to sort of contextualize in a sort of wider scheme. In taking that rose pattern, what we did was we played with different scales of the rose, tessellating it across a sort of panel size, and then using a vector line drawing to create a formwork or a mold that could be repeated. And we would cast concrete into that mold, creating the negative. So in the ornamentation, you kind of always have the projection to give you form. And what we were interested in is the negative and how we can look at the negative to also give form. And then that's what this articulates. So basically what you get is you get this kind of negative indentation of a mold, and it doesn't respond to sort of direct sunlight. It's always this sort of angular sunlight or approaching the building on the angle where the motif becomes evident. And what's interesting is that what that does is as you move around the building, it starts to create different feelings or different representations of the building. So some angles, the pattern is very vivid and rich, and from others, it's quite flat and linear, which is a kind of very interesting game if any of you have ever seen it. This is the building in the context. So as you can see, you have the mass of our building here, and you can see the scale of buildings around this, which we're sort of contextualizing to with the shift. You have the sort of mansion block datum, but then you sort of have the tower block datum that we're looking at trying to contextualize with. For the scene here, so at the setback, we're contextualizing with these, and then sort of at the higher level with the buildings in the distance and nearby. And you can see how, in playing this small game with the elevation and looking at it as a musical composition, how it instantly starts to contrast the regimented tower blocks. I mean, this is affordable housing, and that's affordable housing. And you can see how the two start to really sort of stand out from each other. And again, in the sawtooth plan of the building, where we try to offer bay windows out, you can see that we picked up these sort of cues from the local context. So just around the corner from our building, we have this set of townhouses that also share this sort of relationship where you have the bay window, which protrudes, offering tenants of the building not just a straight vista out, but allowing them to sort of have this panoramic view of the streetscape. Again, the building in the elevation, understanding the mass and how allowing this glazed portion brings the outside in and allows tenants from the inside to have great vistas out. The rose motif on the precast concrete panels. And the setback of the building from the sidewalk level. So in setting back the building, this is the plaza that we start to create, which is a hub for all sorts of different activity and social engagements, bringing back that feeling of hanging out on the stoop back into Harlem. And that's what happens in that space. So allowing it to transform into a sort of vegetable market, or just a meeting point for friends, or a safe place where your kids can ride their bike and not have to feel like they're bound to the apartment at all times. As you can see here, kids just hanging out, playing, families using it as a sort of plaza to get away from the vehicular traffic. And again, now bringing you to the interior and seeing sort of how the space is filled with light through all the extensive glazing on the ground level. And how in the children's spaces, how you have this courtyard, which allows for a spill-out space for the children into a sort of protected courtyard. So in New York City, rather than having a fence or not even being allowed to allow kids to go out because of predators or people prying, basically we've created through this courtyard just a simple sort of way of getting kids to the outside, not having to spend all their time necessarily in a classroom. Again, the sort of full height glazing and how that creates a relationship where nature makes its way into the building, offering great views to the context outside. And because of the height change, it's about everyone on the inside looking out and no one really from the outside being able to look in for the preschool children. And how sort of in this preschool model, everything is about learning. So even, there's this kind of idea of potty training. There's this idea of potty training even within the context. So allowing everything to sort of be exposed and have this sort of conversation of what it is to learn and where that boundary is sort of drawn, and not just be a box off to the side, but making it a part of the entire learning experience. Again, you can see the courtyard. Where we have the preschool on one side, offices on the other, so it kind of creates this protected enclave for children to get from the inside out. Again, more of the courtyards. and how that starts to fill the inner space with an abundance of light. The reception, and that light chimney that we spoke about quite extensively, and how that starts to filter light into the basement levels. Learning spaces and a sort of amphitheater seating for storytelling and children to congregate. More of the education spaces, and sort of how the space is being used currently. So this is that chamber where children can, after visiting the museum, come in to make art and sort of express their creative beings. Oops. And you can see how in that corridor, which acts as a filter between this sort of what we would call the messy room, it kind of has this corridor which acts as a filter, and those sort of niches within the walls that allow children to kind of park to the side and have conversations and congregate, but still allow for circulation to happen without overcrowding. This is the space where you saw earlier, where a wide variety of functions happen. And then this is the view into the permanent, it's not a permanent, but into the changing gallery. Again, the museum within the building. This is at the moment of the entrance, so this is the front entrance of the building here, and by just allowing the top portion of the wall to be glazed, how that starts to filter into the gallery space, but then also allows the gallery users, by the time they make their way to the basement, to reorient themselves and realize the point of entry in which they came back. And this is when we get to the residences, so the material palette starts to change and gets warmer in the residences, timber-lined walls with stone floors. This is in the corridors of a typical apartment floor. And so by playing, you can see here that the wall sort of starts to bow, and by allowing the wall to bow, you create this kind of generous corridor width, which is sort of basically due to area requirements, sort of non-standard in these sort of housing developments. But by, very cheap moves, but it really enhances the quality of the space. And again, the interior of one of the apartments. And you can see how not just doing sort of one or two windows on one facade, but allowing for a third one on a perpendicular wall basically allows for the start of a panoramic view within the apartments, which sort of starts to enrich the living space, which is what we were trying to do ever so vividly. Again, different users, sort of this sort of minimalist user who's just moved in. Typical studio apartment. Sort of the Afrocentric tenant. And the jazz musician. He's apparently turned his apartment almost into a recording studio, if I know. Is that true? Yeah, it is true? Okay. And again, these three vistas or these three windows on two sides, typically you would only have it on one side, which just offer views to one way. But you can start to see how when we put a window on a perpendicular side, how you start to create this panoramic view of the city within the apartments. And your view from the apartments, which is looking to, current tenements here and the regimented grid, but then also sort of that divide that I spoke about earlier where the rich resides, and you have this sort of beautiful landscape this beautiful view to the Manhattan landscape. This is that terrace where the building sets back, so you can see how this starts to create that public space at a higher level, which again offers great vantage points and places for engagement within tenants of the building. And then this is the building from the other side where you can start to see this is the top of the light well that brings light to the basement, and you can see the cuts into the podium that brings light into the deepest parts of the building. Again, you can see how this glazed facade starts to cut the building in two, allowing the upper mass where the residents happen to sort of float above this glass portion, but then you have the sort of textured concrete at the base as well, where the topography starts to dip. And that's the building at night, where I think it's very evident this idea or this want to allow the building to be elevated, creating this muted mass above this sort of very transparent base, giving the building the illusion of it floating above the grade. And that's it.